All right, everybody, thank you so much for being here today. My name is Stephanie Stevens. I am a Microsoft education specialist, joined by my lovely co-host for the day,
Victoria Dean.
Hey, and we are really excited to have Michael Brunetti here today, who needs no introduction, the man of legend and lore, who's going to answer this really big question around what's A5, what's in the box, why do we care? Everybody talks about it like it's, you know, a mythical creature that we're all chasing after. So what is it? What does it do for us? And I'm really excited to hear from you today. So we will turn it over to you and save time at the end for some questions.
Thanks, Stephanie. Mike Brunetti here, folks. Thanks for joining. Just a little bit of background on me. I've been with Microsoft about 16 years, and the past 6 or so focused on education in the modern workspace initially, and then broadening out to our security solutions across both Microsoft 365 and Azure. So you may be wondering, what is a security person doing talking about Microsoft 365 A5? Well, funny you should ask. What's in the box for A5? There's a lot of security stuff in here, a lot of security solutions, a lot of compliance solutions, a lot of everything in A5. For those of you who might have seen a slide similar to this, I've re-swizzled it a little bit, and it's really talking about the differences between A3 and A5. And I've broken these down by different areas of solution, security solutions, compliance solutions, productivity solutions, etc. We're going to kind of go through these at a high level. We don't have a huge amount of time. You could spend hours going into details of all of these, but I'll give you at a high level what is going on here. What are the big drivers for A5? And then we can possibly go deeper into any of the other subject areas on another call. So let's start with the security solutions. As I mentioned, security is probably the #1 driver that drives folks to A5. And although it's driven by the security solutions, we're seeing a greater adoption of the compliance solutions. And then obviously the productivity solutions are the things that benefit the end users. But security solutions can be used to justify the cost of moving to A5 and displace existing point solutions that may be in the environment. And our security solutions really wrap around 3 different areas: identity and access management, threat protection, and information protection. We all know the importance of strong identity, things like multi-factor authentication and making sure that we can validate who the user is. Threat protection, we're always getting attacked from different directions, right? Whether it's email attacks, phishing attacks, ransomware, things of that nature. Threat protection is what helps protect our infrastructure. But then information protection, I think this is probably the most challenging one. How do we protect and identify sensitive data, right? We have a lot of sensitive data in the area of education. We need to identify where it's stored and help protect it to make sure that it isn't accidentally disclosed to the wrong person, right? And we'll talk about all the solutions and how A5 helps with that. First, from an identity perspective, I have to introduce this concept of zero trust. So folks that work in the security industry have heard this term quite a bit. What is zero trust? What does zero trust mean? It means never trust, always verify. So what that means is we're taking a lot of different signal information about the user, about where the user is working from, about the device that they're working on, whether their behaviors. We're feeding that into a decision criteria that's based on the organization's policy, and we apply that to the requests that we receive. Should this user have access to this application or data based on the scenarios that we're seeing, right? Maybe it's a user coming from their home PC that is unmanaged and not trusted. Maybe it's from an unhealthy device that's infected with some sort of ransomware. Or maybe it's just fine. It's a managed device and everything is healthy, everything looks good, and they're trying to get access to certain applications. So we want to take that decision criteria and then we want to enforce it across all the applications and resources that we have. And today in the A3 world, you can do this pretty granularly using something called conditional access. I apologize up front for the busyness of this slide, but what conditional access does is, very simply put, decide under what conditions you want the user to allow access to an application, right? It can depend on what the application is. It could depend on the user's level of access in the application. I think we can all agree, if you take a payroll application as an example, it's very different if you have access to view a pay stub versus the ability to change payroll information, right? So under what conditions do you want to allow that level of access? Does it matter where the user is coming from geographically? Does it matter if the user is on network or off network? Are they bringing ID and password? or are they also using multi-factor authentication for strong authentication? All of these can be conditions to determine whether or not the user has access to that application. And you can do all this today in the A3 world, including nice things like self-service password reset. This is all built into the A3 platform. But we can enhance this story quite a bit with some of the tools that we have in the portfolio around threat protection. We'll come back to this story. So threat protection, again, is defending against threats. And that could be threats to the user's identity. It could be threats to the user's endpoint device. It could be coming via email or collaboration. It could be the document that they're sharing in Teams. There are a lot of threats that come from different directions. And Microsoft 365 Defender is included in A5 to help deal with those threats. It is also part of a larger portfolio, such as Azure Defender, which is designed to deal with threats in the data center, protecting those things that are operating the data center, servers, virtual machines, containers, SQL servers, things of that nature. But we're going to focus on Microsoft 365 Defender, which is included in A5. This is the portion that we're going to talk about, and talk about the areas where it's going to help deal with those threats. So if you take a typical threat scenario, a user browsing a website, or more commonly a phishing email, a user clicks on a URL or opens a bad attachment, we have an exploit that occurs, right? It may infect that end user machine where the attacker gets control over that device. It may compromise the user account, or maybe the user had leaked credentials. They use the same ID and password on public websites that they use at work, right? They're sharing their password amongst different platforms, and that password is leaked. So we have a scenario where the user account becomes compromised, and then the attacker is trying to move to an account of higher value. We call that lateral movement, right? And the ultimate goal is the attacker is trying to get to either a privileged account that has valuable information that they can exfiltrate, or worst case scenario, domain compromise, where they have kind of keys to the kingdom. So we have a number of different solutions in the Defender portfolio designed to prevent these types of attacks and address these issues. We'll start first and foremost with Defender for Office 365, which again, email is still the most common attack vector that we see. But with Defender for Office 365, we can prevent those types of attacks that initiate via email, whether it's bad URLs, bad attachments. We can also extend those protections to other Office 365 workloads, such as sharing files in OneDrive and SharePoint, collaborating in Teams, right? And we can apply our Defender tools to make sure that the user isn't accidentally sharing compromised information or malicious code, or worst case scenario, that it's not a compromised account being used to attack others from within the organization, right? The next end of protection is Defender for Endpoint, protecting that device the user is operating on, whether it's Windows, whether it's Mac, iOS, Android, Linux servers, as an example. We have comprehensive protection both from excuse me, a traditional antivirus perspective, as well as something we call endpoint detection and response, looking for those advanced types of attacks and telltale signs that we see happening at the endpoint. We also added something very important here, web content filtering, that works when the user is off network. So we're looking at, is the user accidentally browsing malicious websites that is designed to, again, infiltrate that device? Or is it just a case where we want to block access to sites that are inappropriate for business, as an example? This filter works no matter where the user is operating. It isn't dependent on the network. So it's done at the client layer. When we move towards identity, we have a couple of scenarios. One, we look for things like stolen credentials, right? Do we have a set of credentials, an ID and password pair, that matches your organization's namespace and is valid? So we'll actually take leaked credentials, test authenticate them against your directory, and if we found a matched pair, now that user represents a higher risk, right? Because their credentials have definitely been leaked, and it's a set of active credentials. Likewise, we need to detect things like user account compromise, attacks against identity, lateral movement, all those types of things that we see. This is often a blind spot for a lot of organizations. They don't see the types of attacks that are occurring against identity, and specifically accounts that have already been compromised, where the attacker is using that account to try and get access to other accounts. That's often a blind spot for a lot of organizations. And then lastly, cloud app security. What is the user doing inside those cloud services, and are there behaviors that represent threats to the organization? Things like a mass download event where users downloading a lot of sensitive files at one particular time in a short period of time, or sequence of events. We see things like a user logs in from a foreign country minutes after logging in domestically. Then maybe they set a mail forward rule on an account to try and gather information coming from that user's account. Those are the types of activities that we can trigger off of with Cloud App Security to, again, identify these attacks as they're happening and take action and automate the response to those. Now, if we come back and build the picture that I showed earlier, which was complicated, and I apologize, I'm going to make it more complicated. This builds out what A5 does from an enhancement perspective to all these conditional access scenarios we talked about earlier. Now that we have threat protection in place, we can look at things like, does the user's credentials represent a higher risk? Do we have that leaked credentials scenario? Do we have a user who's operating from a location different from where they usually operate? A behavioral change in what they're doing. Likewise, down at the device, we have a scenario where we can look at the device health. Is the user's device healthy that they're operating on? And if not, do we want to prevent access to that application that contains sensitive data until the user's device has been remediated, right? So we get a lot more granular control over the user and device scenarios that govern access to applications and data. Likewise, on the right, you see an introduction of Cloud App Security here, using it for what we call conditional access app control. And that is governing what a user does inside the application, not just whether or not they can get access to the application. So to give you an example, if you're using OneDrive, which we hope that you are, and you're storing your files there, and you're working on a device that's managed and trusted, so institutionally issued device, you should be able to sync your files down from OneDrive, upload files to OneDrive, download files, etc., and fully interact with your OneDrive. But what if you're coming from a device that's untrusted? Maybe it's your home PC that isn't managed by the organization. Maybe it's a public kiosk. It's a device sitting in a hotel. That's a scenario where maybe we want to allow access to view files in OneDrive, but we certainly don't want to allow a user to download files and leave them behind on that device or synchronize files to that device, right? Because the device itself is not a trusted environment. So with Cloud App Security, we can get more granular control and say, okay, when you access your OneDrive from that location, you can view files in the browser, that's great, but we're going to wait till you are on a trusted device before you fully interact with what's in OneDrive. And that's just an example of some of the controls that you can do. Now, when we switch gears to compliance solutions, this takes it a step further. We've talked about strong identity. We've talked about protecting against threats. Now we get into the areas of the data itself. How are users working with sensitive information? And more importantly, do we understand how users are working with sensitive information? So part of information protection and governance is understanding how users are using data, where that sensitive data is stored in the environment, and the ability to label it and protect it, right? So we want to identify sensitive information. That could be student data. That could be HIPAA data if we've got healthcare as part of the organization. You can define the different sensitive information types that exist, either using built-in rules in the A5 system or creating your own rules, right? You can look for your own unique sensitive information types and define those as part of the system. We then want to be able to, for the more sensitive data, protect that information and govern its use. Some examples might be, I want to make sure that any document that contains this particular sensitive information type is only collaborated on and worked on by the people that are defined in my organization. So, for example, I have this Word document here with super secret information, right? I may want to mark this as confidential. And in this particular example, I've marked it as confidential, Microsoft FDE confidential, which means that only Microsoft full-time equivalent employees have access to this document, no matter where it is stored. And that's really a key differentiator, is no matter where it is stored is the important aspect. So if I email this to somebody, or I put it on a USB stick and I give it to a friend, or worse, I lose it, nobody can access this document because the document itself is encrypted and the usage rights are wrapped around it such that only full-time equivalent employees who are authenticated to do so have access to it. That's one example. So we can use sensitivity labels to identify the sensitive data mark it as confidential in this particular example, and control access to it. We can also use it to govern the retention of that data. So as an EDU institution, for example, in Office 365, you have unlimited retention to retain data, whether it's email or files in OneDrive, SharePoint, et cetera, based on whatever your retention needs are. It could be, a 7-year period, 10-year period, or whatever the organization defines. A lot of times, though, you have needs to understand the data itself and have a different retention period based on the subject matter, right? And so a lot of the rules, for example, I'm in Florida, the Florida Sunshine Rules actually state that data needs to be retained differently based on the subject information. They're different categories. And that can be a lot of work, right? So you can define these sensitivity labels and sensitivity types to look for this type of data and keep the data or retain the data based on the information that you're looking for. Now, this can be applied across a lot of different storage locations. So on-prem is one, right? So if you've got files sitting on file shares and file servers, you can do it there. SharePoint servers on-prem if you happen to have it. Obviously, in our online services such as SharePoint, OneDrive, Teams, and the like. Email is a common scenario as well. I want to automatically identify sensitive information in email and apply those rules. I showed you how to do it manually, right, in Word as an example. As a user, I can mark something as confidential. But really, the way most organizations would implement this is automatic classification, to proactively look for the types of data that you deem to be sensitive, whether it be student information, again, social security numbers, key information types that you can define in the system, and protect those no matter where they're stored. And this can also be applied to non-Microsoft cloud applications. So there are a number of different cloud applications that with A5, you can leverage cloud app security to connect to those cloud services, reach into those, and also classify the data stored within that environment, such as Box, Dropbox, Salesforce, as an example, some others. So again, making sure that we get a hold and control over the sensitive data that exists in our organization by discovering it, classifying it, and protecting it as required. Now, inside of the compliance features, there are a number of other features that we probably don't have time to go into in great detail, and they're all kind of listed here. The solution pillar is the individual license that's part of A5, and then the features are the features and capabilities that are included within that solution. I've pulled out a couple, though, that I think have been relevant to EDU organizations that I've worked with over the past few years to talk about what their capabilities are. The first one is data loss prevention for Microsoft Teams. That's the ability to block offensive words or really any category of information that you want that is shared during chats inside of Teams chats itself, right? So that's a rule that you can set up to look for the certain content and take action based on the content that you're seeing in chats. Likewise, communications compliance is also looking for different types of communications that are occurring between users and be able to flag those communications and notify a compliance person within the organization to take the appropriate action. Where we've seen this used is things like detecting harassment or bullying between users, right? Communications compliance can identify those types of behaviors. And again, we can single those out for remediation by somebody in the organization. Information barriers is a way of restricting communications between groups of users. So for example, if you didn't want students to be able to see or communicate with school leadership, either through Teams or even email, you would put an information barrier in place between those groups of users. Now, I'll give you one caveat here. This is a pretty strong barrier. So at the moment, it's not incredibly flexible as to the type of communications you want to allow between the barrier. It was originally developed for our regulatory and financial services areas where there are strict rules on communicating between different constituents of users. We're leveraging it in some cases in EDU, and we've asked for a little more flexibility, a little less rigidness with this solution moving forward. So you should see kind of an evolution of this feature over the next couple of months. And then advanced audit. This is providing audit records for 1 year about everything a user does in their Office 365 account for Exchange, SharePoint, their identity, down to, for example, in their mailbox, every single item they access. So every email they've opened, every attachment they've opened, it provides an audit record of that event. And this is very helpful in forensics and compliance investigations. I know this is particularly helpful for HIPAA compliance in our academic medical center space. But basically, if you have an account that's become compromised, as an example, you can go back and say with certainty, what did the attacker access if you have that audit in place to show those audit records. This is not to be confused with retention of data, right, for other compliance needs. So full retention you have built into the platform. These are the audit records, and particularly that per item mailbox audit is very attractive to a lot of organizations. And then lastly, in compliance, advanced e-discovery. So advanced e-discovery is a tool to really help in the post-processing of e-discovered data. Really, if you think about e-discovered scenarios, you've got two main types. You have a FOIA request where you do your e-discovery, you export the data, and you give it to the party that's asking for it. And the second one is involving litigation, right? You've done your e-discovery, you've narrowed down your search, you still have a large volume of data that lawyers need to sort through for this legal review. And what this tool does is help reduce the amount of volume that the lawyers need to comb through. It does a number of things to do things like thread conversations, remove duplicates, and make it more efficient in the e-discovery process. So again, very helpful in litigation and legal review scenarios. Okay, so moving past compliance, let's talk about productivity solutions. This is more of the fun stuff, right? So from most of what we talked about in A5 so far has been around the backend systems, securing the infrastructure, securing users' identity, securing the clients that they're working with, also securing data, making sure that we have full control over how data flows within the organization, and more importantly, how it doesn't flow outside the organization if you don't want it to. In the productivity space, A5 also adds a number of features, specifically in Teams audio conferencing. So this is the ability to have a dial-in phone number into a Teams meeting. So much like we have in our Teams meetings here at Microsoft, when you schedule a meeting, in addition to having the Teams link, you have a phone number available to you to dial in if you happen to be on a phone. There's both dial-in conferencing and dial-out conferencing. Dial-in conferencing is just as it sounds, right? You dial into the meeting instead of joining from a Teams client. Let's say you're in your car, you're mobile, you want to do it easily, you can do that. Dial-out conferencing can be used in a number of different scenarios. One is we're in a meeting right now, like we have. We want to go and pull somebody into the meeting. So we can go into the list of participants. We can type in a phone number of somebody we want to pull in, and it will dial out and pull them into the meeting via the phone system. The other way is callback feature. So when you join a Teams meeting on your mobile, as an example, we do audio over data. So if it makes it very simple to join, if you're on a Wi-Fi connection, that usually works pretty well. If you're over cellular data, especially in the continental US, where let's just say coverage is not perfect everywhere, that can be sometimes a challenge, right? If you're in a low signal area, doing audio over data can be sometimes, involve a bit of a dropout. So you can actually have Teams call you back. So you can join from your Teams client and have the meeting call you back on your mobile phone. And that's another example of dial-out conferencing. So we're full participants in the meeting, but for the audio portion, we're using the telephone network to do that. So those are two examples of audio conferencing. And again, every user that's licensed for A5 would have this capability. When they schedule a meeting, there'll be a dial-in phone number available to them. There are dial-in phone numbers around the world, but you can also request one in your particular area code and LATA, which is the prefix, to make sure that it is local for your callers. We also have toll-free numbers available, but because of the nature of toll-free calling, it does reverse long-distance charges and therefore have a per-minute cost associated with it. But again, with most people having unlimited domestic calling, that's not usually an issue. We don't have a lot of use of toll-free, but you can request it and you can use it for certain scenarios if you'd like to limit its use. Okay. So the next feature around Teams is calling for everyone, Microsoft Teams phone system. This is literally using Teams as your phone system. So the ability to make and receive phone calls directly inside of Teams. You can see here in the Teams client under the calls tab, you have a dial pad to be able to make phone calls. If somebody calls your phone number, it will ring you right inside of Teams and it becomes your phone. And this can be done with any of the Teams clients. It could be on your PC, it could be on your mobile. So this has been very popular in academic scenarios. So giving teachers, for example, the ability to have a phone number that they can make and receive phone calls to without giving out their personal mobile number, as an example. And again, do it from the mobile or from the PC or any of the clients that we have for Teams. Now, there's a couple of different ways this works. The phone system license is part of A5, so that's this layer here in the center. It provides all the phone switching capability and all the capability to route calls and that sort of thing. The next part is you do need a way of getting dial tone to Teams, right? So you've got to connect it up to the phone network. There's two ways of doing this. One is calling plans from us. We have a number of different calling plans that are sized differently depending on usage. Or something called direct routing, where we can actually connect up to your existing telecom provider with some telephony infrastructure and tie Teams into that existing provider. So you don't necessarily have to use us as the provider for phone, but you can if you use calling plans. We are a registered telco. You can port phone numbers to us if you go with calling plans, or you can use your existing provider and go the direct routing method. From an end user perspective, either one of these methods, by the way, results in the same experience. So the user does not know, nor should they care where the dial tone is coming from. They can make and receive phone calls in either scenario. Okay. The last feature we're going to talk about is Power BI. Power BI is an excellent business intelligence and analytics platform for taking data and creating reports and adding intelligence to that data. EDU organizations spend or collect a ton of data. You have a ton of data on student performance, on student outcomes, and we have a lot of different case studies on how Power BI has helped organizations in the EDU space unlock the potential of that data, right? Improving student performance, improving graduation rates in K-12 environments. We even have a law school that's using this in a unique way of showing how their students are more successful in getting through law school and becoming lawyers because of their program versus others, right? So you have a ton of data. The data resides in a lot of different locations. Power BI is the best way to kind of make that data available. You can create rich interactive reports. You can also interact with that data and do a lot of different one-off scenarios. And since we're always on Teams and Teams is the place we want to collaborate, we can build that right into Teams, right? So we can take these Power BI reports, we can publish those inside of Teams directly, and then we can use those in our day-to-day collaboration with Teams as well. So for example, this is an example. Yeah, okay. So this, this is an interactive example of somebody embedding a Power BI report directly into Teams chat as an example, right? So our goal with Power BI is to make business intelligence and analytics and reporting as easy to use as Excel is, right? So think of this as graduating beyond Excel into much more rich reports, rich interaction with data, and the ability to pull data from different data sets as well, and not just from an Excel spreadsheet as an example. Okay, so I'm going to go back to the A3, A5 comparison deck, and that's probably the quickest high-level overview I've done with everything that's in A5. As you can see, there's a ton of capabilities in there. I know we have probably a little bit of time for questions. I'm happy to answer those. And more importantly, if there's areas of topics of deep dive that you want to go into in the future in the next office hours, let's talk about that, right? Something that you'd like to see. So that I'll turn it over to Q&A.
Yeah, I love that approach to generate and tease up some of the things that you'd want to deeper dive on. As you know, most of what we bring to you in the bottom half hour of these community sessions are really based on your feedback and asks. So that would be great to hear so that we can get those scheduled. I am going to just jump back into the chat. I think that there were a couple of questions that popped up. One of them was really around staffing needs to provide adequate support and management under A5. So wondering if you can kind of touch on that topic. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no question. There's a ton of new capability in A5, right? If you look at it versus A3. But with that comes, okay, what does it take to roll this out? What does it take to manage it? And that sort of thing. And that's a question I answer a lot, especially around the security solutions, because some of them are turn them on and gain visibility, right? And not a lot of work to do, not a lot of impact to the end user because they never know what's happening. It's behind the scenes types of things. Things like Defender for Identity falls into that area. There are other areas like Defender for Office 365 where there is some impact and interaction with the user. You're going to protect them from URL attacks with something called safe links, which rewrites that URL. When the user clicks on it, it's going to block it if it's unsafe. You also have the ability to launch phishing attacks against your users and measure the effectiveness of it. And the users who fail the attack can be sent to training, right? That is an option, right? It's not something you have to do, but you can decide, what do I want that attack to look like? Maybe it's a classic, hey, Microsoft thinks there's a problem with your password, click here. Or, hey, you got a UPS package, click here, that type of thing. So we have a lot of different options in that scenario. I'll tell you this, a lot of these capabilities, you can ease your way into them. This is not a fire it all up at one time, right? And some of these, again, will be back-end things that you're going to gain better visibility into what's going on. Others will be things that impact the end user. The nice thing is, from a security perspective with the Defender stack, is we've pulled all of that into a single area. So if your focus is information security, you get from the same console visibility into what's happening from an identity perspective, from a device perspective, or from email. And the ability to pivot on a particular user and say, hey, we're seeing an incident around this user, and it involves an email they received and something happening on their device, and now we see attacks happening on their identity or their account. So we're doing our best to try and take a lot of alert information, a lot of noise, roll that up into an incident that you can take action on, and make it a little bit easier, so that you can do so without a huge team of people. With that said, there are some things that take more work. I mentioned at the top of the hour that information protection, identifying and classifying data that exists in your organization, that's probably one of the harder things to do across IT organizations, because it involves the users, the constituents that own the data, right? As an organization, you need to decide, what are your classifications of sensitive data? What does that look like? And what are the things we want to look for? I mean, certainly, like anything else, there's low-hanging fruit. There are things that we know right away. Anything involving a student number, as an example, is going to involve student data. Therefore, it should be labeled as student data. Those types of things. But there are things that are more esoteric and more complex to deal with as well. The good news is, with any of these A5 workloads, we have a fast track organization that can help you with enablement. And it's not a one and done organization. What I mean by that is, you can decide today, hey, I want to get started with Defender for Identity. How do I do this? We can open up fast track, a team to work with you to get just that piece going. And then when you're ready for the next piece, we go back to fast track for the next workload, right? You can engage them as many times as you like, and they work for pretty much all the A5 workloads at this point, to help get you started. And the important thing is, they're a team that has done it before. They know what dials to push, what levers to throw, that type of thing, and they can help walk you through this process. Does that help answer the question? I hope.
I think it did. Yeah, it did for me. It wasn't my question, but it provided me some clarity. We've also got
a lot of requests for Power BI.
Yeah,
seeing a bunch
I
of Power
think
BI
that's
in there.
a great
That's awesome.
follow-up topic,
Yep.
because I agree. It's one of the biggest differentiators that we see across education, especially. And you know, there's some nuance to licensing around Power BI, and you have to kind of develop your own strategy around who you want at what access level, and licensing. And so I do think that's probably a deeper dive, but anything you would want to cover there from a high level? Trying to see what else we've got here.
We've got a lot of Power BI questions. I think we're going to do a session on that. And we have a lot of great EDU examples that we can bring to the table to show you how others are using it. So I think that would be fabulous.
Yeah, that's great.
I see a question here about what are extra costs for Teams as a telephone system. So yeah, great question. So as I mentioned earlier, the only additional cost beyond A5 is whether or not you want to buy calling plans from us or use your existing provider, or a third-party provider. It doesn't even have to be your existing provider. There are a number of different ways to go about this. Calling plans from us are certainly easy, right? You buy a calling plan, you take a phone number, you configure it in Teams, and you assign it to a user, and they're ready to go. But that isn't necessarily the best option, right? A lot of it comes down to a financial analysis to determine, do calling plans from Microsoft make sense versus how we're doing telephony today? with an existing provider or existing contracts that you might have, things of that nature. When you connect up to an existing provider, there's a piece of infrastructure called a session border controller. That's the interface, standard telephony stuff. We won't go into great detail there, but that interfaces Teams to the calling provider. And that can either be managed by you or managed by the provider now. So it could still be hands-off, even if you don't go with Microsoft calling plans. Calling plans from us, again, they vary based on number of minutes included, but they start at $6 per month. And I think there's actually a promo right now at $3 per month. So that's the really low end side there. And the minutes included with each calling plan are pooled. So if you have, for example, our lowest plan is 120-minute outbound calling plan. If you had 1,000 people with a 120-minute plan, they're sharing 120,000 outbound minutes per month. We only meter outbound. We don't meter inbound. It's unlimited inbound. And so when we work with customers on telephony, we look at usage patterns. What does telephony look like in your organization? How many users? About how much traffic are we seeing? We figure out what the most cost-effective solution is. And again, like I said, from an end user perspective, they get the benefit of doing telephony directly in Teams, which is awesome. And it doesn't matter where the dial tone comes from. It can be from us or others. It's fine.
Yeah, and I definitely put it in the chat, but I think it's worth repeating. Telephony in A5 is a way to approach the equity of access that we've been after for a really long time in education, considering that we have students learning anywhere, anytime, anyhow, and they have a whole group of communities and families around them that need to have access to things like meetings, like our district that our children are in are using their A5 license not only for Teams meetings for parent-teacher conferences, but also for the dial-in. So it was the first time that grandma and grandpa could join in and hear what we're going on, inside of our conferences, which was great because they do not have a Teams-ready device, but they were able to dial in. So it just changes the game, and I don't think we think about that as much sometimes as we think about the technical lift. All right, let's see. We've got about 2 minutes left, so.
I see a Defender for Endpoint question.
Yeah, grab it. Go ahead.
Can Defender for Endpoint detect and prevent a compromised device from communicating on the network or internet in real time? Yes. So device isolation is one of the things that Defender for Endpoint can tackle. So the idea behind that is to isolate that device to stop it from spreading its issue with other devices until the device is remediated. We didn't go into great detail about remediation with Defender for Endpoint. It can be configured for auto remediation or manual intervention. And there are pros and cons to both approach. It really often depends on the usage scenario of the device. A lot of times end user devices, we want to focus on auto remediation because of the volume of devices, and we don't want to sit there and have to deal with each one of them. But maybe a server, for example, might be something you want to manually remediate if we see an issue. But yes, a device isolation is part of it. We can do a deeper session on Defender for Endpoint at some point if you'd like as well.
That would be great. And then I think if you can just touch on Marge's question here around Microsoft as a registered telco. Do you have any information about that? Looks like they've got new legislation on critical communications providers.
Yeah, this is the first I've gotten this question. But we're definitely a registered telco because basically if you do calling plans from us as an example, you would port a number. You could port a number to us. So we have a porting center, and customers have done that as well. We also have E911 services that are included as well. I'll have to take that offline to find out
Sure.
what this provider list is, how it was formulated, and if we're not on it,
How to get us there?
Why we're not. We'll figure that
absolutely.
out. Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely. All right, guys, listen, I know that we've got at least a Power BI follow-up session that we've generated out of this, but I'm going to go ahead and end the recording here. Mike, thanks so much for taking time to join us today. Thanks to the community for great questions and great engagement. And we will see you on the flip side next Thursday for another session of MS Office Hours. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.